Thank you, everybody, for coming. It's nice to see a full room. Thanks for coming this afternoon to the Wilson Center.
Louder, please. You gotta be right up on these.
Yeah. I'm kind of stalling to let people filter in at the last second. My name is Abe Denmark. I'm the director of the Asia program here at the Wilson Center. We have on tap a very good discussion today on dynamics across Eurasia. Joining me, Robert Daly, the director of the Kissinger Institute on China and the United States, and Matt Rojansky, director of the Karenina Institute. So here we have, for the Wilson Center, represented our directors for Russia, China, and everything else on the Eurasian subcontinent. We've recently completed some trips to the region, to China, to parts of Central Asia, and from me and Matt to India, which will be informing the conversation today. What we thought in terms of format would be, I'd ask, I think first Matt and then Robert to give their first takes on dynamics for our subject today. Really just to give maybe 5 minutes to get things going. Then we'll have a bit of a moderated conversation before we open things up to Q&A with all of you. So to kick things off, turn things over to Matt. Okay. If you have, did you want to go first? Right? Yeah.
I'm happy to defer to Robert.
Okay, Robert, if you want to go
right.
first.
Okay. Well, you may all have heard that there are things afoot in Eurasia, in what used to be called the world island. If we just look at today, we have up on Capitol Hill, the United States-China Economic and Security Review Commission is holding an all-day hearing on Belt and Road 5 years out, looking at Chinese ambitions in Eurasia from, I think it's safe to say, a skeptical view. They look at geostrategic issues and they look at Chinese mercantilism. We also have in the New York Times, China reaches into Europe, about the impacts of Chinese involvement in Germany, and also in today's Washington Post, an op-ed titled "America is Wrong to View China as a Geopolitical Threat." And I think that those, just from today's hearings and headlines, help to broadly frame the issues we want to talk about. Matt and I, in December, were in Beijing, Urumqi, Astana, and Moscow to learn how the foreign policy analysts in China, Kazakhstan, and Russia are looking at Eurasian integration. And then just this month, Abe and Matt were together with Russian colleagues in India, and a lot of those conversations touched on the same issues. So we may be bringing some of those trip views in as well. But this is not just the findings from a single trip. The Kissinger Institute and the Kennan Institute have been working together for a few years, looking at prospects for Sino-Russian Entente in a program we call Russia and China on Their Own Terms. This trip was a continuation of this, and it built on an earlier trip that Matt and I had made together to China. So when we look at Eurasian integration, one of the immediate issues is defining what exactly it is that we're talking about. There are many different versions of this story, this project, this dynamic. The one that has caught the most attention worldwide is what China calls the Belt and Road. It now calls it the Belt and Road, or BRI, which was announced by Xi Jinping in 2013 in Astana and then in Jakarta. But this idea of a more integrated Eurasia is hardly new and hardly Chinese. It was discussed at length in the United Nations in the 1960s, but when there wasn't the capacity or even the will to do anything about it. And it has been discussed in various capitals since. Nursultan Nazarbayev has talked about it often throughout his 27 years in power. Belarus, Azerbaijan, other nations all claim to have had this vision of some kind of Eurasian integration. So it's very hard to agree on what the it is that we're talking about. But I think we can agree that it's big. This is going to be big. Xi Jinping is thinking in big terms. Eurasian nations and Africa is also part of Xi Jinping's Belt and Road. It's more expansive than that. I'll come back to that in a minute. But Eurasia and Africa comprise 57% of the world's landmass, 86% of its population, 65% of GDP, and it is estimated by 2030, 87% of the world's middle-class consumers are going to live there. Again, we're 5% of the world's population. Xi Jinping now speaks of Belt and Road as extending beyond Eurasia to maritime Southeast Asia, to all of Latin America, Central America, and the Caribbean. We heard this again just this week. And then Matt and I, at a conference in Beijing in December, were told in a very high-level conference that Xi Jinping's vision of integration and of what he calls the community of common destiny, now they're calling it the community of common future, but in Chinese it's clearly destiny, also touches on non-human species, the animals and the plants. So we've got a, let's say, a comprehensive, if not always a clear vision. But I throw these stats at you about Eurasia because one of the, it's not even a subtext, it's a secondary part of the conversation, but often primary for us. Whatever the integration of Eurasia means, it seems pretty clear that the United States may be playing a secondary, at best, part in this story. So part of this is the story of declining American relevance in the region and the question of what we should do about it. China now wants to take advantage of this very enormous region and wants to employ its foreign exchange reserves, #1 in the world, its construction expertise, its lending power, the lending power of its state-run banks, and its excess capacity in steel, aluminum, and concrete, as well as other building materials, all of which are far and away #1 in the world. They hope to access and leverage that power to integrate Eurasian infrastructure, which is what we hear about primarily. But it's not just that, and this is very important to China's vision. It is information flows. This, by the way, is not, I'm not interpreting anything here. This is in China's own planning documents. Information flows, financial systems, including pushing international use of the Chinese currency, the RMB, technical standards, customs clearance practices, academic exchanges, and people-to-people exchanges. It is a vision for a Sino-centric Eurasia, comprising Africa as well. So, a Sino-centric Eurasia. Now, this is not talking about world dominance. Okay? It's Sino-centric, an area in which China enjoys deference and preeminence, if not dominance. But still, it's hard to know how to understand this. Xi Jinping's plan is operationally extremely vague, and I'll just stop by making this note and then hand over to Matt. If you read the planning documents of the NDRC, the ones that were published in 2015, it's very long on praise for cooperation. It says nothing about the political and security challenges of laying rail across parts of the world that are the most remote, undeveloped, and intractably violent on Earth. There's nothing about security or politics. So how do we frame this? My own take so far, and it's evolving because these are all moving targets, is that we are probably in the 21st century going to see the gradual, organic integration of Eurasia through infrastructure. And I'm sure that China will play a major role in financing and constructing. But that's different than saying that this is a Chinese plan that China will lead and that others will sign on to. I sort of see Belt and Road, the Belt and Road Initiative, as Xi Jinping's word for his fantasy about the role he would like China to play. And other than that, it's going to be a work in progress of fairly high consequence. And lots more to say, but I'll stop there for now.
Well, thank you, Abe and Robert. I realize that the framing of this discussion and the presence of the three of us heading, broadly speaking, kind of the Eurasian programs of the Wilson Center has a bit of a Three Musketeers quality to it. My goal is that it not turn into a Three Stooges quality. So be kind. This is an ambitious subject matter. And by definition, we've taken snapshots, right? And that's true in the sense of our respective pieces of knowledge, but also, you know, where we've been on the ground, right? I fully acknowledge we have not seen the entire scope of the infrastructure projects that have been undertaken. We have not had the conversations with the political officials, with the business people who are executing all elements of this vision, which I think Robert broadly, correctly describes as the integration of Eurasia through infrastructure rather than per se Belt and Road. And we really ought to talk more about that kind of naming and framing issue. I want to, and let me also say, by the way, I'm despite its limitations, I'm very proud of having been able to undertake this effort, and I think it's very Wilson Center, right? It's very much the kind of public service mission of the center to be able to bring the world back to Washington in this very authentic, on-the-ground way. All right, so caveats and introductions aside, I want to give you two narratives that I picked up full bore when we were on the ground in Russia and in Kazakhstan. The narrative about Russia is what I'd call kind of the sandwich, or maybe the sandwich cookie. And it's west, east, west. What I mean by that is that Russia's take on this thing, this integrative Eurasian, greater Eurasian process, very much starts from the west and not the east. And we heard that, we saw that, we even, I would say arguably, felt that in the way in which some of the background assumptions, some of the style of conversation, some of the sense of humor changed once we crossed over this sort of civilizational boundary, if you will, between China and the former Soviet world, and then very much when we were in Moscow, we were clearly having a conversation that was framed, largely speaking, in the same terms in which conversations about Asia and Eurasia are had here in Washington. Now, we disagreed about almost every element of the content of the conversation, but it was framed in very similar ways, as distinct from, for example, the way that Robert described the 19th Party Congress and Xi Jinping's kind of vision, which felt very foreign and almost impossible to grasp and put our fingers on because it was rolled out in such a radically different format and such different terms. So Russia begins from the premise of being more or less a part of the West, if at the moment an alienated part of the West, a resentful part of the West. But this was something we felt. It's not a political statement. This is a description of reality as you feel it when you're on the ground in Russia. Now, that said, 2/3 of its territory is, of course, east of the Ural Mountains, but Russians also acknowledge that the vast bulk of its economy, population, and orientation in almost every sense has been and is with Europe and the Atlantic world. And so it's not surprising that when, in the aftermath of 2014, maybe I ought to switch microphones. Are you guys hearing that kind of buzz thing in the background? No? Okay, great. When in the aftermath of 2014, Russia suffers political isolation, economic sanctions, and all manner of punishments from the United States and Europe, it is forced, in effect, to deliver on what had been a long-standing rhetorical concept of a pivot to Asia, not unlike the American pivot to Asia, but it's forced to try and give legs to that pivot. And so looking east starts in the West. That's what I mean by kind of the first layer of the sandwich. Now, the content, of course, is about the East. Russians describe to us the idea that, hey, you know, China's return to a central position in Asia, the overall rise of Asia writ large, so not only China, but the kind of the growth to fulfill this level of expectation of middle class, consumption, production, centrality in the global trading system, all of this is natural, it's happening, we watch it happening, and we want to be a part of it. That, recognizing the fact that Russia is clearly not going to be leading it, Russia is not going to be setting the terms for it, and in fact, this it, whatever we choose to call it, and again, I like the idea of reintegrating or integrating or reintegrating Eurasia through infrastructure rather than per se Belt and Road, it's actually going to test what Russia already has in the region. It's going to test Russia's physical infrastructure. It's going to test its human and intellectual capability to absorb this reality when you consider at most 10 million people on the East Siberian and Far Eastern side of the border in Russia, and then something like 300 million people on the Chinese side. That's a test of very many kinds, including a psychological one. And then ultimately, many Russians suggest to us it's going to test this concept of balance, that for a number of decades now, Russia has been able to keep its relations with China and with other Asian countries in balance by virtue of its relative strength as a military power, even in the Pacific theater. So that may be the case today, but plenty of Russians were aware that that is not necessarily enduring indefinitely. So the content of this from the Russian perspective certainly is about Asia. But here's where it becomes sort of ironic and interesting, and ultimately the narrative is pretty entertaining. It doesn't end with Russia as a great Asian power, both because Russians don't really know what that would mean, I challenge you to find a Russian who can conjure up in their head what it means to be Russia, the great Asian power, but also because of the opening here, the opening gambit that it is in fact Russia's relations with the West that's motivated this pivot. What more Russians than not told us they'd basically like to see as an end result is a rebalancing of their relations with the West. So in other words, the motive is Russia comes back from this Asian integrative process and has a stronger hand vis-a-vis the partners, more or less, they care most about, and that is Europe and the United States. It's a very strange irony, but it is very deeply baked into the way Russia thinks about all of this. So that's the sandwich idea. And then very quickly, if I can, a thought about Kazakhstan. What we heard and in some respects absorbed on the ground in Astana was a narrative about keeping spheres carefully separated. So we heard from government officials and from experts and from outsiders, from international observers, that the Kazakh model up to now has essentially been to take from each basket what it views as most advantageous from that basket. So of course from the Russian and former Soviet basket, it is deep and long-standing political relationships, integrative structures and frameworks, and military alliances. And with those come certain risks, but also certain guarantees, and there's value in that. But the Kazakh message was very clear. We keep that separated from the economic and business processes that we engage in with China. So we're not at all interested in having our deepening commercial infrastructure and investment relationship with China bleed over into the political and security and even cultural space that we share with Russia. That was crystal clear, and of course, immediately lots of question marks pop up behind your eyes. You're thinking, well, how are you going to do that, right? Because, you know, politics follows economics and security follows politics. But, you know, sort of, we'll reach that question later. For now, that's the vision. And then when we ask, well, what about the American or the Western side of that? So I'd say, well, from the West, we like to take know-how. We like to take, you know, sort of management expertise and technology, and we'll keep that separate too. And what they said very explicitly was, we're not going to repeat Ukraine's mistake. We are not going to mix political association and trade and security such that we provoke a crisis. And I'll end my narrative on this, which is, interestingly, that seems to be working okay for Kazakhstan for now. And I would suggest to you that the factor that's already been named once indirectly, the first name starts with N and the last name is Nazarbayev, that factor is probably critical. It's absolutely a linchpin to that model of keeping spheres very carefully and cleanly separated. That is the big question mark that hangs out in the future. What happens after Nazarbayev?
Really terrific presentations by both. I'm struck with, just sort of get our conversation going, I'm struck with questions about broader strategy from both Beijing and from Moscow. Matt, you described this concept of keeping spheres separate, which strikes me from a strategic perspective as a very difficult objective from both Beijing's perspective and from Moscow's perspective. So I wanted to ask how Moscow is thinking about a strategy that seems to be increasing Chinese power, that seems to be potentially making Russia and to a greater degree even Central Asia something of a pass-through between. We're down to mood lighting in here. The red lights turn on. That's when we dive. Turning Russia into a greater degree, Central Asia into something of a pass-through between China and Europe, which seems to be not really so much keeping spheres separate as expanding the Chinese sphere potentially at the expense of the Chinese and Central Asian sphere. So I'm curious about how the Russians are thinking through that dynamic. And for Robert, and maybe you could start, you mentioned in your presentation that your sense is that the Belt and Road Initiative is not so much a big plan from Zhongnan Hai, but rather a label or an ideal that Xi Jinping has slapped on a more organic process of Chinese business people trying to make money, trying to get rid of excess capacity, but still trying to slap a label on it and speak to broader ambitions for regional security architecture, regional economic architecture in Central Asia, Europe, now Latin America, Africa, animals, plants, everything. So I'm curious how this strikes you, how in China, how you think this strikes in terms of strategy. There is, as you mentioned, an element of sinocentrism here. Right. So if you could talk a bit about the mix of sort of organic happenings on one hand with a broad plan on the other, and how they're thinking about how this may rub up against other spheres of influence, be it Russia, the United States, or even Europe. And maybe you could start.
Well, since Xi Jinping announced Belt and Road, then One Belt, One Road in 2013, there has actually been a pretty vigorous, healthy debate within China about what this might mean. And people argue about its goals, they argue about its presentation, but those arguments have largely gone away because, among other things, this TIFA, this slogan, BRI, has become part of Xi Jinping's bid for elevated power within the CCP. So you have to swear fealty to the Belt and Road Initiative, even if you don't know what it is. And then money also comes to your think tank and to your conference and to your university. If you put a Belt and Road component to it, you get money. So that debate has abated somewhat, but we know that the Chinese themselves have doubts about it. There are many elements of this move to the West that make very sound strategic sense for China and that may very well be achievable. Many of the Chinese voices in 2013 described this primarily as a response to our rebalance to Asia. When they look out to Southeast Asia and look to the Western Pacific, they see the United States as an obstacle to China achieving its ends. But when they look west, which is what Wang Jisi, many of you may know, first proposed in 2010, they don't find their goals as contested, certainly not contested by the United States, which is largely ignorable. So here is a way to build infrastructure, increase China's trade, increase its pipelines. They need energy, they need food, they want trade. They want to develop other areas and be seen as a good player. They also want this infrastructure, and this is a big part of it, to build up Chinese cities in the west of China, and especially in the far west, in Xinjiang, which we also visited, although not really for this reason, on this trip. This is a way of continuing the Hanification of Xinjiang and of building up those regions as well, with a tremendous deal of confidence that this will then bring soft power and influence to China. And this is a coherent and perhaps largely achievable strategy as they set out. But they have created barriers for themselves in the way that they package it, in that most of the nations in the region are very aware of China's ancient and future desire for, if nothing else, strong deference in the region. They are quite fearful of this. And Matt, I'd like to hear your views on this too, as a newbie to Russia and Kazakhstan. I was struck that they do not share American and Western European interest in China. Here we have frustrations with China, but we've always been fascinated by China as well. There's a certain romance. They don't have this. There was a fear, which I sometimes sense bordered on a near sort of almost yellow hordes racism of being overrun by an expanding China, with reference to their own histories in Kazakhstan and Russia. So China faces a lot of blowback, and they face critiques both of acting as neo-colonialists. They face this in Africa, they faced it in South America, they're facing it somewhat, although not in all countries in Eurasia. In some places they're most welcome, because they're mostly getting involved in resource extraction. And they're also accused in some quarters of predatory economics. Rex Tillerson has said this is one of the sessions up on the Hill is about today. And the accusation here, although I don't think that there is yet sufficient evidence to make this stick absolutely, is that China is building what it knows to be white elephant projects, that extending loans that cannot be paid back, at which point China will take over the assets and thereby be able to build out its own bases. This is the accusation. I think that is, I don't think it's quite defensible yet. But so if China can stick with the basics and get the packaging right and not overreach on this, I think it will find investment and involvement welcome. Russia and Kazakhstan do welcome that, as long as they believe they can control it.
Jeez. I knew I was going to have a problem with these bar stool things. You know, I grew up in Northern California, kind of outside San Francisco, and we had a lot of folks coming and settling from Hong Kong and Taiwan when I was growing up, and of course, in more recent years, much more from the mainland, even to the point that you have, you know, whole apartment buildings in San Francisco that are sort of famously bought up by folks, you know, exporting their capital from China. It's a safe place to keep capital, and it's not bad to have a swanky apartment in San Francisco as a golden parachute. But what I've almost never heard in California is the sort of thing that we heard and heard of when we were, for example, in Kazakhstan, which is right next door to China, and which, you know, in so many respects has got so much in common with their neighbor, other than size. And that is, you know, Chinese not welcome here. Chinese not welcome to own property here, for sure. This is threatening to who we are. This is threatening to our history. This is threatening to our relative status within our own economy and our polity. So that actually surprised me. I had seen that in Russia before. So go back not that long ago, and there was a lot of very protectionist talk, both on the micro level and the macro level. The famous Chinese market outside Izmailova getting literally shut down just overnight. And by the way, the fact that Russians call it a Chinese market doesn't mean it was actually mostly Chinese people in the market. It may very well have been Vietnamese sellers, whatever. But you know, racist, protectionist. This is all sort of well known and is kind of baked into Russia as a European culture for a long time. Russia, after all, participated in the unequal treaties and the sort of century of shame, I think is the term.
Century of humiliation.
Century of humiliation, as the Chinese have described it. So I think to your question, Abe, you know, how does Russia manage rising Chinese power? This was the interesting question in the background of a lot of our conversations with Russians. I see a couple things. Number one is a certain degree of willful myopia, just, you know, schadenfreude about the West now having to suck it up and deal with someone who is just objectively strong enough to dictate terms. And awesome, great, fantastic, you know. Yes, there are probably some knock-on effects that are not going to be so great of an increasingly Chinese-led world order, but we've been warning you guys that it's a multipolar world, and you didn't listen when it was just us telling you that, and now it is, so there. The problem with this, I think, is illustrated by Russia's relationship with Iran for the last 15 or 20 years, which is kind of willfully myopic about the bigger effects of increasing Iranian power and influence in the region because of the narrow interest in, hey, a reasonably functional relationship, bilateral relationship between Moscow and Tehran, and the ability to stick a thumb in the American eye, you know, across the board. And almost no Russian argues with a straight face that Iran is a broadly positive actor in the world, even though it makes the micro case that, well, in the Middle Eastern region, it's kind of a status quo power, blah, blah, blah. So I think there's a bit of, obviously, much, much larger scale with, you know, less, with a different set of problems, but I think that's the willful myopia, where Russia simply doesn't have to take responsibility for the whole picture. It may argue things about multipolarity in the world at large, but it doesn't ultimately have to own all of the world's problems, the way that up until at least recently Americans more or less assumed that we had to. And then two additional quick points, both of which I think really speak to your expertise, Abe, more than anything. You know, the military balance. I mean, Russians are really reliant on the idea that they have got disproportional relative to their population and their economy, military power, including the ability to project that power in the East. I mean, why, if in fact they are, and there is that allegation, the Russians are violating INF, the Intermediate Nuclear Force Treaty, if they're doing it, is not because of Europe. It's not because they want to deter France. It's because of China. And so their nuclear deterrence is incredibly important, their naval capabilities in the Far East, The fact that they have done, we were all freaked out here in Washington about Zapad, which means west in Russian, Russia's exercise in the Western Military District. Well, just a couple years ago, they did an exercise, and they're constantly doing SNAP exercises in their Eastern Military District, and they have really impressive capabilities there too. So the military balance, and by the way, don't forget, there's a reason why I said we were crossing a certain boundary when we got on that airplane to fly from Xinjiang, which geographically looks very much like Kazakhstan, into Kazakhstan. And one of those boundaries is members of the CSTO, the Collective Security Treaty Organization, which is a kind of Russian-led NATO, and Kazakhstan is a member. Kazakhstan is a treaty ally of Russia. So Russia's treaty allies in Asia are also important to its conception of sort of defense in depth. And then lastly, other Asian countries. I mean, remember, Russia is engaging with Japan, with Vietnam, with India. I will not forget one of our Russian interlocutors saying, whoa, to Indians, well, we built your nuclear sub for you, right? There's got to be another side to that transaction. What did they get in exchange, right? Maybe reassurance of some kind vis-a-vis China in the middle.
Yeah, that was very, very helpful answers. The exchange with India, I wanted to get to India later, but the exchange with the Indians, I think they were remarking on how similar the Indian submarines look to Russian submarines, and certainly a lot of story back there. I wanted to pull a couple threads from both of your answers to talk about a part of Central Asia that we haven't talked about yet, Afghanistan. Robert, you mentioned that in China's conception of BRI, that there's little to no consideration given to security issues. When you first said that, the first thing I thought of was Afghanistan. With Afghanistan sharing a small but extant border with China, Chinese concerns about instability and extremists potentially floating into China, but also just more the regional instability threat that could come from Afghanistan. And Matt, you talking about how Russia seems to be happy to not take ownership of world problems. To me, that also spoke to Afghanistan. We, the United States, we've been in Afghanistan now for over 16 years. We've tried a wide variety of strategies. And if you talk to people who focus on Afghanistan, they'll say what we need is more time and more resources. And so if you look at the Trump administration's strategy that was put out, when they talk about Afghanistan, they say they have very maximalist goals of defeating ISIS, defeating Al-Qaeda, et cetera, bringing stability to Afghanistan. And to achieve that, they're increasing the U.S. troop presence there by 4,000, which for anybody who's been looking at the past, we couldn't achieve those goals with 100,000 more troops. The idea that 4,000 will bring it, I think, is questionable. But if you ask experts on this, what they say is what we need is more time for Afghan forces, for Afghan government to stand up and take more ownership. But clearly, other countries in the region, especially China, Russia, are looking at these issues in terms of Belt and Road, in terms of Eurasian integration, but also in terms of security. So I wanted to ask both of you your sense of how your respective areas of focus, China and Russia, are thinking about Afghanistan, and how that may affect their approach, both in terms of geopolitics, but especially for the topic here today of Eurasian integration.
China feels sort of damned if it does and damned if it doesn't with relation to providing global public goods. When they don't, we call them a free rider. When they do, we say that they're expansionist. But it did seem, beginning, and you would know actually more about the details of this, Abe, but midway through the Obama administration, that there was a truly genuine American interest in having China play a larger role and helping to enhance stability in Afghanistan as America drew down. And this seemed to be sincere. How much of, better you than me and so long sucker was part of that, I don't know. But it seemed to be a sincere wish that China would get more involved. And China has made commitments along these lines. But we don't yet know where it's going. There was a report about 3 weeks ago that China was establishing a new military base, what it calls a logistics and supply base, not far from the Khyber Pass and the border of Tajikistan in far eastern Afghanistan. They just denied that yesterday. They said that that is a groundless rumor. I'm pretty sure that all of the rumors about new Chinese military bases over the past 5 years have been true eventually. So we're in the denial phase. And again, it would make good sense, both in terms of stabilizing Afghanistan, which we should want, and in terms of China's quite legitimate concerns about terrorists and ISIS fighters coming back into the west of China. So this would be a reasonable place for them to have a supply base. They're denying it for now. But I mean, was it your sense that in fact we were sincerely inviting them in? And then also I wanted another question you asked me, but I would love to hear your views on it. The relation of Belt and Road to security. Xi Jinping, in his first year, said Asians are perfectly capable of taking care of Asian security, which means it's time for the U.S. to exit stage left. I have never heard him tie that thought to Belt and Road explicitly yet. I don't know whether you have, but I think your thoughts on both of these areas would be helpful.
Yeah, sure. In terms of talking to the Chinese on issues of Afghanistan, of course, it's an area that we've been talking with them about. The challenge that the U.S. and China often come to in this is how we kind of sort of ground terms that when the U.S. tries to talk to China about the fight against ISIS or the fight against Al-Qaeda, the Chinese often try to expand this more to talk about the fight against terrorism and countering terrorism more generally, which of course raises American concerns about assisting China in the repression of its own people, how you define terrorism. I think the Chinese tend to define terrorism much more broadly than we do. In the past, at least during the Obama administration, we were concerned about doing anything, at least in the mil-to-mil area, that could help China repress its own people. So that's always been a difficult hurdle to overcome, but I think there is certainly an overlap of interest there, especially as China becomes more engaged in Afghanistan. Since we're in the denial phase, I think there's certainly a bit to be done there. Matt, did you have anything you want to add?
Well, the tagline on Russia and Afghanistan hasn't changed for 30 years, and that's Afghan syndrome, right? You know, I asked this question naively, but also ingenuously of some Russian interlocutors in New Delhi last week. I said, well, so does the relatively shared interest, and I would probably include China in sharing this interest, among New Delhi, Washington, and Moscow that Afghanistan be stabilized, does that help Russia somehow be more ready to go actively into Afghanistan, even if it's just civilian infrastructure construction and, you know, some things, drug interdiction where Russia has, you know, real capabilities? And the answer was absolutely not. Of course not. You know, Vladimir Putin has earned a lot of political capital that's stored up in his piggy bank, and he's not about to blow it all by being, you know, the Russian leader who brings Russian boys back to die in Afghanistan, right? He's got enough of a problem, you know, continuing with the narrative the Syrian war is over when, you know, Russians are still being shot at in Syria. So that's a non-starter. But what is an active area for Russia on Afghanistan is Central Asian states as a buffer zone for Afghan drugs, weapons, et cetera. And there I would point out that I think Russia is getting the better part of the US-Russia kind of competitive narrative, which is the United States went in 2001 kind of promising a whole lot of things to Central Asian states that would partner with us to prevail in Afghanistan. You know, it's been more than a decade and a half. Those states mostly don't feel that they got any of the things that they were promised. Some of them have actually switched sides and kicked Americans out of the region. And Russia is present physically on the borders, at least in Tajikistan, assisting with border security, you know, as a treaty ally of Kazakhstan, as an economic partner of Kyrgyzstan. So Russia, in some ways, is actually in a better position in Central Asia today because of the trial balloon of America's presence in Afghanistan, i.e., more or less in the region, that kind of popped or fizzled or whatever it is. And therefore, when Central Asians, and I heard this in Uzbekistan in November, when Central Asians hear the message from the current US administration, what can you do for us in Afghanistan? They're like, you're kidding, right? You know, we would have bought that 15 years ago, but we're not interested in opening up that conversation now as an entree to kind of American engagement in Central Asia. We've been there, we've done that, and we're not particularly thrilled with the result.
Good. One last question before we open things up to Q&A. I want to make sure we had enough time for that. And you spoke to, but I wanted to broaden the aperture again beyond Afghanistan. The role of the United States in all of this, both as how the United States is playing a role in Eurasian integration, or the role that it could be playing in Eurasian integration. Robert, you mentioned that the real backdrop is the perceived withdrawal or decline of American influence, and that for China, the way Wang Jise talked about it, it's a way for China to expand its influence without bumping up against the Americans. And in India, during our conversations, we did hear from the Russian interlocutors, and I think a bit of showmanship in there, but there's probably some messaging in there too, of saying, you know, American sanctions against Russia have been pushing us, the Russians, to work more with the Chinese than we'd really like to. That, you know, this is not really something that we're comfortable with, that we're aware that it's not really in our strategic interest over the long term, but because of these horrible sanctions that you put on us, of course, for no reason, it's forcing us to do this. Of course, I think there's some polyandrous in there. But it does speak to the broader question I wanted to ask you two before we open it up, is the role of the United States, either the role that we are playing, the role that you think we could be playing, the role that we think we should be playing as Eurasian integration continues to move ahead.
Look, you know, I have tentatively concluded that there are some aspects of a major global balance of power change that you know, we really shouldn't be struggling against, because we won't win and we'll just look kind of ridiculous and waste resources in the effort. On the other hand, certain basic notions of rules of the game, of, you know, a rules-based order, that there should be an order and that it should involve rules, are really worth fighting for. And the reason for that is, if we let it go, if we presume that those whose power is rising are less convinced at this moment of the need for those things, and we therefore let them go through action or inaction, we're going to end up having to renegotiate them at some point, because it's a universal truth of the way that states interact with one another. Unless we all live under someone's imperial thumb, and that seems relatively unlikely until the Martians arrive with their superior technology, you know, then we're pretty clearly going to have to work out rules for how we interact with one another. And I would argue that what we've got now is better for more states in the system. That when the rubber hits the road, it may be rough in one area for one state, but it's better for more states more often than anything that we'd come up with if we took that jar of jelly beans and shook it around until the red ones were on top, you know, more of the time. And I think that, unfortunately, is what a number of states in the system, including from time to time our own, are looking to do, is kind of shake that jar until they get the color that they want at that moment towards the top of the jar, so when they reach in, that's what they get. And the thing is, you do that and eventually, you know, the jar breaks, and that's, we're getting close to that.
Yeah. Well, let me dig in on that before I turn over to Robert. In your previous statement, you're talking about, I like the metaphor, and I like the Martian overlords especially. I, for one, welcome our new Martian overlords. But I wanted to dig in on this idea of promoting liberal international order, of course, which I support generally. But in your previous answer, you were talking about how there's very little appetite for American leadership in the region. That we had a shot 15 years ago, 16 years ago in Afghanistan. We blew it. Now they're not terribly interested in us engaging again. If this liberal order in Central Asia and Eurasia is worth supporting, worth fighting for, how can the United States do that, considering where we are?
The answer is we won't do it, right? We won't do it alone, and I think that this dynamic that's now been reported pretty widely in the press and in social media of, oh my goodness, trade agreements are continuing without America at their center, right? We're seeing this in Davos this week, I guess, with Canadians pushing TPP, et cetera. That is a perfect illustration. The idea that it will be coalitions of states that, broadly speaking, you know, are positioned to benefit from the same sorts of things that we would be, and they may or may not succeed in getting, you know, climbing as high on that sheer cliff face as we might have been able to boost them up to, because they won't have us boosting them up if we're not there. But if they get there without us, one thing is for sure, our interests will be far less protected in the end result. And that is potentially what we see happening now. I am probably naively optimistic. I had an amazing time in China now. It was my 3rd visit. I don't see a compelling reason why China is not, at the end of the day, open to being part of that sort of stakeholder community and the rules-based order. The reason being, so much of the way in which China has become both rich and powerful is similar to the way we became rich and powerful, right? You know, urbanization, industrialization, you know, big ideas, the China dream, the American dream. They're different in content, but in process they're so similar. Why wouldn't the Chinese ultimately come around to the notion that there should be a rules-based order? It's a question of whether the lines will intersect in time before we kind of destroy what we've got. But maybe I'm naive about that. I'm clearly not a China guy.
So maybe, Robert, if you could talk about your perspective on the role of the U.S., either as currently established, or how you think potentially we could play a role in Eurasian integration. Maybe you could also talk to Matt's naive expectation of Chinese support of a liberal order.
Well, some of you have heard me say this before, but it's still where I stand on these questions looking forward, and these questions about what should our policy be, what can we do. In the past, I was willing to offer some answers because I thought that there was a consensus, Democratic and Republican and broadly cultural, as to what American values and interests were and how we interpreted and employed those when we dealt with the rest of the world. And I feel like we don't have that consensus anymore. It's hard to offer a policy prescription that isn't high fantastical. If I base it on, you know, the consensus from all Democratic and Republican presidents until 2016, that American security and prosperity depended on American leadership and depended on America's protection and promotion of the liberal world order, I could, you know, make that pitch and would agree with Matt on that, but I'm not sure that that satisfies your where we are now question. China's ask for us on BRI has always been the same. China wants us to, what they say, biao tai. They want us to say some nice words about the Belt and Road Initiative to say that we're on board. And what I think we can say, not to China, but we can say, because it's easy and it doesn't cost us anything and that it's true, is that the 21st century may see the gradual integration of Eurasia through infrastructure. And if it did, that would likely be a marvelous and epochal change, that we expect China to play a major role in that, and we welcome China's role as long as it upholds the highest standards for labor rights, human rights, environmental protection, transparency of bidding, something like that, without christening Belt and Road. But it can be beneficial for many people, and what worries me most, and I haven't sat in, obviously, on the hearing up on Capitol Hill today, but simply looking at their headings, there's all kinds of things about Belt and Road that we can criticize and should be very skeptical of and very cautious about. But the biggest issue is our own non-involvement, our lack of a policy for Africa, for Latin America, for Central Asia. This is the real issue, and so I would like to see a little bit more emphasis on our own relations in these areas and a little less carping about what we fear China might do.
Well, thank you both. We still have until 4:30, so we have a good amount of time for questions. Please, if you're called on, give your name, your organization. Please make sure that your question ends with a question mark. Yes, sir.
Thank you. Good afternoon. Alex Sanchez. I'm a defense analyst for some places. One quick question. You talked about the CSTO and right now, but what do you think is the future of other regional organizations in Central Asia? When we talk about Central Asian Eurasian integration, you have the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, which brings together Russia and China. You have the Eurasian Economic Union that has Russia as a member. They just created a new customs union. Now I heard that Kazakhstan wants to create once again the idea of a Central Asian Union. So what do you think is going to be the future of this soup of alphabet soup of organizations that Central Asia has right now. Thank you.
Okay, maybe we could get another question and start basking up. Yes, sir.
Stanley Kober. Associated Press published a story a couple weeks ago, quote, "From Pakistan to Tanzania to Hungary, projects under President Xi Jinping's signature Belt and Road Initiative are being canceled, renegotiated, or delayed due to disputes about costs or complaints host countries get too little." Does anybody have the cost estimates about here is what it will cost and here is the profit we will make from particularly the road? I'm less concerned about the belt, but the road part of it.
The road part, confusingly, is the maritime part, the linkages of new ports, which are then tied to rail to move containers around.
Do you want to answer that?
Well, right. So that I know the story that you mean. What Belt and Road actually means, conceptually, we've spoken about difficulties. It's also, to date, impossible to measure. There is no reliable record of how many of the promised Chinese funds are actually in operation on ongoing projects. There is no record of how many of those projects are bankable, are going to have a return on investment, and how many of them are going to be white elephants. And a lot of construction projects within China are itself underused. There's also no way of knowing how many of these investments, railroads, ports, container ports of various kinds, highways, how many of these, if they're bankable, would have been built anyway without Xi's declaration of Belt and Road. Remember, the Eurasian trade has been expanding very rapidly without Xi as sort of the herald for integration. But since he declared Belt and Road, China tends to credit anything that happens in Eurasia that could plausibly be linked to this effort. They tend to say that this is part of Belt and Road. The total needed investment estimates for which range from 1 to 8 billion. So it's a pretty big estimate. Again, it was going on anyway. Europe's trade with Asia from 2006 to 2013, when Xi Jinping came in, grew 40%. Since Xi Jinping and Belt and Road, it's grown an additional 9%. So we don't see a great uptick. From 2013, when he declared Belt and Road, until 2016, Asian, Middle Eastern, and European freight volumes have all declined. China's economy is slowing, its outward investments are slowing, its domestic infrastructure projects are being canceled for versions of this reason. So it's very hard, both conceptually and in any sort of metrical terms, to know what exactly this means. And the fact that it's so closely allied with what's becoming a cult of personality for Xi means that it's very hard to get any good numbers coming out of China. So a good question, and all I can do is affirm the question.
Alex, to your question on Central Asian, or really I'd call them Eurasian regional organizations, I'd cite the Anna Karenina principle, right, which is that, all happy families are the same and all unhappy families are unique. And so, the happy family of Eurasia is what we've just described, integration of Eurasia through infrastructure construction, and where it's happening, it makes sense, and it works, and everybody's happy. I mean, almost no one is unhappy because everybody gets to be included, directly or indirectly, and everybody gets to benefit from it. Arguably, even in the political and security space, where these architectures work to the extent that they work, they track with natural phenomena, natural dependencies anyway, right? So the idea that you would have, for instance, Kazakhstan and Russia in either not in some kind of common economic space, even a common defense framework, when you consider the physical geography of their very long border that has absolutely no natural barriers to it, it wouldn't work. And so it does work to do the alternative, as long as you don't test it too acutely. What isn't working right now, at least, is the vision that, for instance, SCO, which has been broadened so much as to be everything and nothing, right? I mean, India and Pakistan are now both members of SCO. And if there was one thing I learned, again, not at all being an expert on South Asia, in New Delhi last week, it's that there is probably not a more zero-sum relationship on this planet than New Delhi and Islamabad. Well, they're both members of SCO, so I don't know how to measure that. Or the the C5, which is the term I think Washington actually attached to the 5 Central Asian countries. I'd love to see, Kazakhstan and Uzbekistan find a way to share some kind of vision. I hesitate to use the word leadership because that implies that there's a leader, for something that is bigger than just, their interests at that moment. Thus far, I haven't seen that happen. I've seen conversations have begun, which is better than not, but it's not there yet. So, it's different at the Eurasian Economic Union, right? That this is a case where if you do significant trade with Russia, it kind of makes sense to take advantage of the elimination of trade barriers with Russia. On the other hand, if that costs you your WTO membership in good standing, it's not so good, right? Or if it costs you, in the case of Belarus, the ability to profit massively off of arbitraging, Russian domestic price energy and then selling into the European market, that's not so good. But maybe you don't have any choice because of the security factor. So, every unhappy story here is a little bit different depending on the circumstances.
We Asia people never get to talk about Anna Karenina. That alone is a good reason to keep doing this sort of thing. Marvin, and then Rachel.
Marvin Ott, Wilson Center. I'd like to just press Matt a little bit harder on the Russian perspective on China. If I'm correct, and Bob and Abe may know this from firsthand observation, if you go to the Army Museum in Beijing, the mural map showing the historic boundaries of China extends to Lake Baikal. And if I'm Russian, I'm aware of that. And I'm also aware that the Chinese military budget, and I don't have the numbers at my fingertips, now greatly exceeds the Russian military budget. And the trajectories will only widen that gap. If I'm Russian, I am scared to death at this point. And I'm wondering whether we're understating the magnitude of what would be a genuine Russian fear and paranoia with regard to China and Chinese power.
It's a very serious question. And I hope I wasn't dismissive in addressing it initially. There's far more to say, but I think that the overall arc of the answer is the same, which is that it's a living contradiction. It's a dynamic contradiction. That on the one hand, here Russia welcomes China into the Baltic Sea, where it's terrified to have Baltic Sea littoral states, right? Like the Nordic countries and the Baltic countries there. It's terrified of them because they're NATO members. Well, it just brought the fox into the hen house, right? It does an exercise with China in the Baltic Sea. Why? Okay, well, it goes into this bigger problem of Russia isn't taking ownership of all the world's problems. It's focused for the moment on advancing its vision and its interests where it can, and China is arguably a very powerful and useful instrument for doing that. On the other hand, is it right that the Chinese are spending, I think it's about 3x the Russian military budget, maybe more than that. I think it's like 90 billion versus like almost 300 billion. So it's about 3x. Yes, that's true. Can the Russians, kind of, not that they'd tame this tiger, but they'd sort of, can they even exist in the ring with it? When asked 10 years ago now, in 2008, he had just finished his second term as president. Putin was asked, what was your biggest foreign policy accomplishment? And he cited the resolution of the long-running boundary dispute with China, so that the Russia-China border was settled. So there's clearly a sense of vulnerability, but there may be a sense that between our still significant military advantage, which is technical and operational and human capital and a lot of stuff that's real, and the fact that politically we have a reasonably positive relationship. And let's not forget the personal side of it, right? Putin and Xi kind of famously seem to have hit it off. I think the view from Moscow right now is, hey, we got it covered, and it's actually useful to us in a few areas, and if it becomes someone's problem, let's hope it's America's.
And from the Chinese side, that's also roughly true. You're quite correct that there are people in China who look to the maximal boundaries of the Qing dynasty and say that if it was ever notionally ours, it always should be, including in some cases the Ryukyus, in some cases Korea. But actually China is very happy with the way that it has settled its land borders with every nation but India. And it likes to say that it has actually given up more than it got in those discussions. And that story about its giving up some of its territory and settling boundaries, despite its history of what it calls the unequal treaties. That's become part of the sort of moral narrative for the good, non-self-interested diplomacy of China today. And this is something that they use when they talk about supposed expansionism in the Western Pacific. Look what we did with our land borders. And so I think that there's a very similar mindset from a Chinese point of view on the other side of the border to the one that Matt just described.
Good. Maybe the two of you next to each other could.
Hi, Rachel Salzman, International Trade Administration. I had two quickish questions. The first is, a lot of the conversation, as you, Robert, mentioned, is about hard infrastructure in the integration of Eurasia. There's very little conversation about what this means in terms of soft infrastructure. So customs training, for example, agreement on what gets seized, what doesn't get seized, how all that happens. And if you, either of you, Matt or Robert, could comment on the extent to which that seems to be part of what's happening, whether China is going to get into the technical capacity training game if they're not there yet, those sorts of questions, and the extent to which those would either actually really halt BRI in its tracks at the end of the day, or if they'll just muddle through. The second question is a little bit broader outside of traditional Eurasia, but still on the Eurasian landmass, which is questions about what Chinese investment is doing in terms of relations within the EU. So we have the 16+1 and significant Chinese investment in infrastructure and sort of what was at one point called New Europe. And you also have proposals from Western Europe, particularly from China, France, and Italy, from Germany, France, and Italy on giving a bit more scrutiny to Chinese investment of what might be viewed as strategic assets or in strategic sectors, and what you think the impact of that split will be.
What made you think those were quick questions?
Caitlin Antrim, Rule of Law Committee for the Oceans. I'd like to look at the maritime connection that's beginning to tie more of Eurasia together, particularly when the United States applied sanctions to development in the Kara Sea and Yamal Peninsula. Russia made a major change and accepted Chinese money. Most of the tankers that are going to service that are being built in South Korea, and Japan is talking about increasing activity there. And more non-energy materials are going up to the north for shipping. So this seems to be something where we've kind of pushed Russia to go to take an area they consider very important, development of the north, and literally handed it to China, and our allies in the area. I mean, that probably was a bit out of your territorial examination on this trip, but I'd appreciate any thoughts you have about that as well.
Well, I'll make sort of one quick comment and then hand off to Matt and then maybe take back that one. We're hearing more and more. We hear it with NAFTA from Canada and Mexico, with Pakistan. This is something we've got to get used to. Anytime now that we do anything people don't like, it's, dude, you're throwing us into bed with China. Do you know what you're doing? We don't want to, but we're there. I mean, this is something that's becoming, it's both true and sort of easy. And it's a new claim that we're hearing from new countries almost every week. We did not talk about the opening up of the polar route and what that meant on this trip at all. I was aware of it, but it didn't come up.
Rachel, on customs, this is a great question and certainly not one. I mean, our experience of customs was airports in capitals, so obviously we didn't experience what you know, what do you call them, rail cars, you know, of goods are experiencing. But there were these two warring pieces, and I think they both ran in the FT. It's a funny thing. Was it
back-to-back days?
Yeah, about the Khorgos dry port, which is on the Kazakh-Chinese border, and supposedly, you know, the world's largest dry port, and so on. And what was interesting, and I don't have an answer to this. What was interesting is one of them suggested, yeah, it's all fine. I mean, everybody's incentives are that we streamline this process, and yes, we do have to change the rail gauge to you know, ride on the slightly wider former Soviet tracks. So we have to stop, you know, momentarily to do that, but that can be dispatched in, you know, a few hours. And by the way, the customs stop, we were told in Astana, it's down to 40 minutes. It's 40 minutes, right, from like multiple days. Well, but then this article comes out the very next day that says, nothing doing, you know, it's multiple days. You know, I've heard from other sources in the region who are less, you know, self-interested in this particular opportunity, they've been like, yeah, no, you know, the problems of corruption at the border, the problems of just chaos, of spoilage, these are all so real that the upshot, I think someone cited to us a figure that I haven't found anywhere else, is that in order to send these trainloads of goods, that the Chinese actually have to subsidize to the tune of something like $2,000 per container, every container that goes across this route. Again, I haven't been able to substantiate this elsewhere, but if that's the case, that answers your question, right? No.
And we still know that sea freight is far cheaper than the overland routes, even when they're quicker. I mean, the advantage supposedly is speed, but for some of the products for which that's relevant, especially fruits and vegetables, now that we've got these refrigerated containers, speed becomes less of an issue. So there are people who have analyzed how freight moves, which they still don't see the play for the overland routes. In terms of what you call sort of the soft integration, that's in the Chinese plans, but it's mostly aspirational. You said there's enough difficulty knowing what's really going on with the infrastructure, with the hard components. We don't yet know where the soft ones are. But again, this is why I don't like to talk about Belt and Road, but about Eurasian integration. This isn't just about getting everything to China. There are north-south routes. This is about getting Eastern European goods to Central Asia. It's about getting Czech goods to Thailand. This isn't all about China. So we did hear a lot of talk. We haven't mentioned this about the need for an integration of integrations, for sort of an overall master view, but it's vastly complex and it hasn't begun in a serious way.
You know, it's fascinating the way you talk about the north-south integration in Central Asia, because it's not something I've looked at, but it's very similar to integration efforts in South Asia, where the Chinese have been pushing projects that emphasize north-south integration through Pakistan, through Burma, through Thailand, whereas India and Japan really have been pushing infrastructure that's more east-west integrative, trying to connect all those countries, of course in a competitive role. So the fact that that's a similar dynamic is happening in Central Asia, I think, is really interesting and points to the idea of integrating the integrations. Other questions? Obviously. Yes, ma'am.
Hi, my name is Maria Perisic, and I worked for 20 years in the World Bank Group, and I worked on trade and transport projects in South Asia and in between Central Asia and stuff like that. I think that the problems with customs and stuff, they're very political issues because these depend very much on the securities of each countries. And we had, like, for example, I had a project between Bangladesh, India, and Nepal, and the big problem is that, for example, India does not want to accept the IT standards of the United Nations, so because of that security issues of the country. So I think that after everything that you're saying, it's very interesting, but I would like to come back to exactly what you said. I think that at the moment, United States internally has to put order among ourselves, because to me it seems like that China, Russia not so much, but China at this moment is actually exploiting this moment where there is kind of a fuss in the United States, and we are coming out, China is coming out and it say, okay, I'm coming now into a market, I am, going into this new project of infrastructure of the whole world, and they're just kind of exploiting this moment. And another thing is that because on the China side, they strategically do things. For example, they had most recently, it was like a fifth or the sixth organization in Eastern Europe. They brought together 16 Eastern
16 plus 1.
16 plus 1. And they are going to finance the road between Hungary and Serbia. They are going to do something in Czech and in Czech.
But the Hungary-Serbia road is an interesting case because they were actually found to be in violation of EU rules for open and competitive tenders. And so it's been sort of put on ice for now. So this is an example of the different kinds of standards and how it's going to play out.
Exactly. And then it comes out that one thing that we should not forget always, United States is the major shareholder of all the multilateral institutions, like the World Bank Group, like the Asian Development Bank, like the European Bank and Reconstruction and Development. And China and Russia are the borrowers. So there is a big difference between the borrowers and those who are the lenders. So United States is still the lender, and these are the borrowers. So we are in actually, on one side, you would also, on top, finance or help the well, still, because if you start talking about the technical assistance and stuff like that, and about what the knowledge and things like that, they are coming from these multilateral institutions. So the United States really has to find out the way to, no, the question is like the question is exactly what you said. Where do you think that we stand within the United States? How are we going to be able to get our act together so that we can see what we can do?
It's too big a question. I don't even think that we're thinking about this in a reasonable, actionable way.
Another question in the back? I thought I saw a hand go up. Yeah.
You know, we built coalitions over a century with different countries, and different countries have different cultures, how they build coalitions. What can we read from the behaviors of the Chinese versus, you know, Russia has their coalitions, ASEAN. What can you see from behaviors and how they treat coalitions, rules? You say, if we don't have rules of order, we're done. So just comment about culturally how you can predict, do you see China evolving to be better able to work with coalitions? Because I think Russia does a better job than China does.
I know a lot of people who've worked with Russia in coalition type settings who would disagree probably, but it's a great question for Robert.
Well, as we said many times, the story of China remains a story of change. It is evolving, it is adapting, it is learning how to be a more effective world power. But it's too soon to talk about how it could work within coalitions. It is still, as part of its formal policy, averse to any kind of alliance. It has a non-alliance policy. But I do think that it is clear that China does expect deference to its interests, certainly on its periphery, increasingly worldwide. And this is, again, for everything I say about China, I know that, yeah, what about the United States? How egalitarian were we? Let's just assume that that's been said. But we don't see China taking, wanting equal shares. We see it wanting deference. And I've quoted him before, but I think it's important. Bilahari Kausikan, who's a Singaporean senior diplomat, he said that China expects deference not just in policy within Southeast Asia, but incorporated as a state of mind, recognition of Chinese superiority. That's pretty important. And I think it probably applies in non-Southeast Asian places as well, which doesn't mean that China couldn't bring benefits to other countries. And it doesn't mean that, it wouldn't make the pie bigger, but it'll take the biggest piece of the pie.
So let me quickly comment on that as well before I turn things over to Matt to comment on another issue. Personally, I've had innumerable conversations with Chinese interlocutors, both official and unofficial, about U.S. alliances and partnerships around the region. And in my conversations, the questions that my Chinese interlocutors ask always suggest that these alliances, that these relationships are fundamentally one of dominant and subservient, that the United States is forcing a country to do something that it doesn't want to do, that the other country is either cowed or is a rebel that's not doing what it's supposed to do. The idea that two countries could, through mutual interest, cooperate is something that's very difficult for from the Chinese people that I've talked to fundamentally understand. And I think it speaks to a more basic understanding of international relations as being inherently and fundamentally zero-sum. And until that fundamental conception can change from a Chinese point of view, their ability to build coalitions, their ability to lead coalitions, I think will be fundamentally challenged. Matt, you wanted to talk about
I want to make a similar type of point that is countervailing about the advantage that China enjoys now, and this speaks a little bit to your point, Maria, about the United States being the largest shareholder in international institutions, is that what I have increasingly been conscious of in the last couple of years, not exclusively about China, is the issue of perceived momentum and the shifts of perceived momentum globally, I would argue, in international relations being determinative, much the way that they are in politics, just sort of domestic politics or politics writ large, or in markets, in the stock market, for example. And I can give you two easy examples. It was never the case. We know historically, the intelligence community knew this, that the Soviet Union had outstripped the United States in defense production. It was never the case. But the perception, the perceived momentum of the Soviet Union after World War II was that they're going gangbusters. And so we got the missile gap. We got an otherwise rational, serious political debate, which became absurd. And then in the 1990s, not far from where I grew up, Silicon Valley had all the momentum. It was not the case then, and it still isn't the case now, that Silicon Valley is a bigger percentage of the economy, that it employs more people, et cetera, than sort of traditional dirty industry or whatever, however you want to describe it. But I think we can say in hindsight now, all the momentum was with the new economy, and it still is. And as a result, how does the stock market value, right? So I would argue in the international system, in international relations, China is a massive beneficiary of perceived momentum, and we are on the exact other side of that equation.
We have time for a few more questions. Yes, ma'am. And then in the back on the aisle.
Tianlu Reitman, I'm a Chinese translator and teacher, so I'm sort of an amateur in this. But going back to what you were saying about the cult of personality, so I came here from China about 6 years ago, right before Xi took office. And I was surprised to see, everybody calling Xi Dada, Daddy Xi in China. And I was even more surprised to see a lot of people starting to call Putin Dada. So I wonder what, between the relationship between these two leaders, how has the relationship changed between China and the U.S., especially whether you've seen that with the people that you talked to in this trip during China, and also where you see this is going?
One of the shifts that had been building up, but that I heard expressed most clearly on this trip to China, is that I think we've been downgraded as a worry to the Chinese. Over the past 10 years, we'd hear a lot, you probably heard many versions of this, Abe, that the United States was the greatest obstacle to China achieving its rightful place in the world. I think now we're more of an annoyance, that they're not as worried about United States actions. We are seen in decline. I think Trump is widely viewed as a paper tiger who can be manipulated through flattery, and both in our formal discussions in Beijing, and then after we left Beijing, Matt and Ambassador Roy and Sandy, some of the rest of, and Ray and I went down with our Chinese hosts to the Kunming Burma border. And so at the last night, the Chinese fellow from the State Council I was sitting next to said again privately what they'd said in different words publicly. He said, look, it's a big ocean, it's a big world. When are isn't it the better part of wisdom to just face up to the facts sooner rather than later? We wish you well, but clearly this is going our way. Can't you pull back? So that we've gone from obstacle to annoyance in many ways. It's been it's a simplistic kind of pat answer to a bigger question, but that's a change that I see.
So I have a different take on it. I don't know, Matt, if you do too, but from my conversations with Chinese interlocutors, my reading of Chinese articles is a little different. It's less that they see the United States as an annoyance. I think most Chinese, especially in the security realm where I tend to focus, still recognize that the United States is incredibly powerful and in fact dangerous. Yet they also see the United States as inherently and from their perspective maybe inexplicably distracted and distractible. That from my conversations with Chinese scholars, for example, they can't for the life of them understand why we would be in Afghanistan for 16 years, why we'd be in Iraq for since 2003, Libya, all the other things that we get into, and now saying that is how does that make America, how does that make the United States geopolitically stronger? They see it as more of a sap of our geopolitical power, of our comprehensive national power. So I think they see us as distracted and sort of all over the place. And now with our current politics, and this actually started before the current election, although I think it intensified during the most recent presidential election, is seeing as American democracy as something that's actually a weakness for the United States. And talking about how, the Chinese system is so much superior because we have unity, we have stability, we have harmony at home, and we can focus on these things these things overseas. Of course, there's very little true to that, Americanists in China still see democracy is a strength of the United States. But I see it as less as the United States as being increasingly less relevant, but more as something that's distracted. Pulling out of the TPP, I think, for the Chinese is something that they're still trying to struggle to understand why we would do that, although I think they're fairly happy about it. But not trying, at least the people that I speak to in the security realm, not taking the American withdrawal for granted and still seeing us as very dangerous and hoping that we keep our focus elsewhere.
Since you mentioned Putin and Xi, one of the cool things about getting totally outside your comfort zone is that sometimes you observe things that you wouldn't observe when you're fully engaged in the conversation, understanding it in the native language and so on. And so what I saw in Russia and China, respectively, is that Putin's brand is better in China than is Xi's brand in Russia. But China's brand is better in Russia than is Russia's brand in China. And that was very striking to me because there's a vast gap between leader and nation. And I will give you a bonus on that, which is at the moment at least, Trump started out strong in Russia. At the moment at least, Trump's brand is worse in both countries than either. But the United States actually does better than either in both countries as a brand.
I think distinguishing between leader and country, I think, is very important. I remember when I first went to China as a graduate student, I went to a little store owned by this nice little old lady in Beijing. And when I went to go pay for my stuff, I saw over the counter was a big portrait of Stalin. And as an American from Colorado, that's pretty striking. Yeah. I think we have time for one more round of questions. Yes, sir, and then in the back on the aisle.
Thank you. Brian Pollins from The Ohio State University. I am quite struck by Xi Jinping's long-term vision of Chinese global leadership, but I wonder about, there's one big fly in the ointment that I see, and that has to do with their currency. And he must see this, and I wonder about what your take is yourself, but also what do you think that Xi Jinping sees about the fact that, dude, you don't have a convertible currency. And so, and for all of the weaknesses in the US economy and the fact that we have a president who is doing everything he can to shirk the role of global leader, the United States, the dollar is still the reserve currency. So for this long-term view of Chinese global leadership, what happens to renminbi? When does it become a convertible currency? When does renminbi begin to replace the dollar as a reserve currency? What does that look like to you? I'd be interested to hear, any member of the panel. And what do you think is that story in the eyes of Xi Jinping?
I can only give you a very quick short-term view. You got another question?
Hi, Dan Moran with the Institute on Religion and Democracy. Going back to culture a little bit, part of Xi Jinping's vision for a preeminent China is sort of a resistance to Western culture, maybe preservation or return to traditional Chinese culture in every aspect as possible. Do you think with Eurasian integration they can really keep that, or do you think perhaps, if over decades slowly the sort of economic interdependence and connections will slowly start to at least globalize, if not Westernize, their culture?
So two really fast, grossly inadequate answers. First, I don't know enough I'm not enough of an economist to give you a long-term answer and to know when they might actually convert. But we do know about Xi Jinping that he is about control. This is the one very consistent thread in all of his policies. And they're nowhere near ready to even experiment with a free float. In fact, they're moving in the other direction because he can't let it float without losing control of it. They're not anywhere close to doing that. And as long as those remain Xi's instincts, I suspect that Xi will remain the premier leader beyond 2022, so it could be a while. On the cultural side, you're right that Xi Jinping has been pushing China's special characteristics and 特色 as part of China's strength. This is really not a coherent narrative. And so as China becomes more integrated, they face this contradiction between China's claim to be sui generis, its denial that there is any such thing as universal values. China can generate its own culture, and its desire for leadership, and its desire for acceptance. Because if your culture is comprehensible to others and acceptable and adaptable, well, then it's not quite so special and so sui generis, is it? And so he's sort of trapped in his own, I think, not really thought through rhetoric. But to come back to Belt and Road, that problem is a little bit abstruse. It won't keep people from taking Chinese checks.
That's right. Just as my own reaction, especially to the question here, a few weeks ago, I had a conversation with an American sinologist. We were talking about the 19th Party Congress. It was just after the 19th Party Congress, and I asked why the rest of the leadership is going along with this centralization of power into this one person. You know, what's making everybody go along, other than they got a file on them and everyone's getting blackmailed. There's got to be something else there. And he said, everybody in the top leadership in China understands that there are hard times coming, that the economy is starting to slow, that social instability is starting to increase. And to them, the way to maintain stability during the hard times is strong, centralized, unified leadership. And so to them, for many in China, the Xi Jinping being powerful, being strong, focusing on control is all about getting ready for the hard times. And I think that also speaks to the currency issue as being recognizing that hard times are coming and not wanting to float in order to make things even worse. And I'd also point that, as far as I know, still the most popular movie in China is Titanic. And I think that says a lot.
So just quickly on the currency question, you know, the only point I wanted to make, I'm far from an expert on monetary policy, but I would argue that the persistence of the sterling as a reserve currency illustrates that, you know, convertible reserve currencies are not really strictly about your percentage of global GDP. Right? There's a kind of network externality effect there. As long as we all more or less agree that there's value in holding this as a reserve currency, then guess what? There is. And so when we agree that RMB has that value, I'm not saying that it'll be like a meeting, but you know, when that happens, then it will become a real significant global reserve currency. But up to that point, it's going to be dollars, even if the United States as a percentage of the global economy is not equal to that level. And maybe this is a good point to end on, which is I'm really not a fan of the recurring conversation that we seem to have in, like, you know, airport lounges with other people who gallivant around the world, and it's like, gosh, it's such a shame that there's now a Starbucks on every corner in Moscow and a McDonald's, and I'm like, no, it's not. It's actually really great. I have watched Moscow in the last 30 years go from being like, you know, I haven't watched it for the full 30 years, but I've watched it from being a place where you basically had to look very carefully before you went into a restaurant to, like, you can go into any one of the restaurants up to and including the local, you know, versions of every international chain that are usually better and more interesting. And so my argument on China, again, as a total outsider, is Beijing looks pretty neat and interesting, and to the extent that the rest of China becomes accessible to the world and to Chinese as a result of increased prosperity, increased interconnectedness with the world, it's probably a good thing. I'm not terrified that Chinese culture is going to disappear tomorrow. It's pretty deeply ingrained.
I think that's great. I actually, even though I'm not a coffee drinker, I share your take on Starbucks. I'll close with this point. When I was running around for the Pentagon, I was going into Ulaanbaatar in Mongolia. And I was with my Mongolia desk officer, who's much more fashionable, younger, and socialized better than me. And as we're flying in, I asked her, tell me about Ulaanbaatar, what's it like? And she just sort of sighs and says, they have Louis Vuitton, but no Starbucks. And I think it says a lot about where Ulaanbaatar is, and I think it says a lot about the role of Starbucks in integration, not only in Eurasia, but with the US. So with that, thank you all for coming. Please join me in thanking these two.